Welcome friends, in this lecture we're going to learn about swizzling with vectors. Okay, so before we begin, let me show you one more way of getting these components outside of a vector. We saw x, y, z, and w, r, g, b, and a. There's also s, t, p, and q. So this is another way of doing the same thing. These are for texture coordinates. I forgot to mention these in the vectors lecture, so here you go. You can also do this. But let's get back to the topic of this lecture, which is swizzling. Swizzling is also basically just getting the values outside of a vector, but in a very different way, which is very powerful and flexible. So let me show you the basic usage of swizzling. So let's say that I want to create a vector 2 or vector 3 using the values from my vector here, which is a vector 4. What I might do is I might create a vector 3 here. Let's call this v3. And I might set this equal to vec3, use the constructor, and then I can get the values outside of my vector one by one. So .x, .y, .z, like this, and create a vec3. So this is how you would do it based on what we learned so far. Swizzling is the same thing, but it just makes it much more simple. So instead of doing this long thing, we can do is we can say vec3 v3 is equal to my vector dot x, y, z. This is going to get x, y, and z components from my vector, and it's going to create a vec3. And then we're going to save it inside of v3. So these two things here are exactly the same. Swizzling just lets us make it in a much more, shorter form. And we can use swizzling to create any type of vector, a vec2, a vec3, a vec4. In this case, we're creating a vec3 from a vec4. We could also get a vec2, for example, from my vector. I could say xy to get a vec2, or I could say rg to get a vec2, xy, same thing. I could do the same with this vec3 we created here. I could say v3.xy, or I could say v3.xyz. But obviously, let's take this vec2 up here, my vec2. I couldn't do my vec2.xyz because it doesn't have a z component. It's a vector, it only has x and y. But swizzling doesn't end there. We can also use swizzling for assignment purposes. So for example, I could do my vec2.xy, or let's do vec3 because that makes more sense. So vec3.xy equals my vector.xy, like this. So we're setting the x and y components of the vec3 to the x and y components of my vector, which is a vec4. So swizzling also works for assignment. But there is more. With swizzling, we don't have to follow this order of x, y, z, w, or r, g, b, a. We can actually mix it up. So for example, here, instead of doing xy, I can do yx to mix the order. I could even do zw, or xw, or let's say wz. In this case, we're going to take the w component of my vector and put it inside of the x component of v3, and we're going to take the z from my vector and put it inside of the y component of v3. We could also change these here. We could say yx or zx. And you get the idea. So with swizzling, the order doesn't matter, we can change it. And we're also not limited to using these components once while we create a vector. We can actually use them multiple times. So for example, I could do something like my vector.xyxy. And this is going to create a vec4 like this. My vector.x, my vector.y. And then it's going to do the same thing again, like that. And it's going to create a vec4 that has xy components of my vector for its xy, z, and w. So we could do this in any form we want, basically. I could do my vector.www to create a vec3 that has the w component of my vector 3 times. I could do something like my vector.zz to create a vec2, or I could do zzYx to create a vec4 like this. As you can see, this gets crazy and you can use this in any form you want, but of course you can't do this for assignment. You can't just say x equals, for example, my vector, let's see, vector.xy. You can't do this because you can't assign, to x twice in one assignment like that. But other than that, you can go crazy with these rules. Swizzling is very powerful and it's something that you should learn because it's going to make you very efficient while you program shaders. That's why I'm going to give you a challenge here. And the challenge is going to be simply experiment with Swizzling. Just do what I did, create some vectors and try to get other vectors from them using Swizzling, assign it to other vectors and just go, a little crazy and see what you can do with them. Don't worry about making mistakes. If you make a mistake, Godot is going to warn you with an error and then you can, fix it easily. So give this challenge a shot. It's kind of an open-ended challenge, so, spend as much time as you want and then come back when you're done. Okay, so that's going to basically conclude this lecture. In this one, we learned about Swizzling, which is a way of obtaining any combination of components from a vector in any order we want, as long as it is a valid vector type.